The crystal chandeliers of the Fisher Theater cast fractured light across the marble lobby, each shard illuminating a different shade of Detroit society. Victoria Ashfordson adjusted her Hermes scarf with practiced precision, the movement calculated to catch the light and draw attention to the vintage Cartier brooch, a family heirloom, she told 3 different people tonight, though she'd actually purchased it last week at an estate sale in Grosse Pointe. "Darling, you simply must meet the Hendersons," Victoria's voice carried across the pre-show reception, pitched at precisely the volume to ensure maximum audience. "They're the ones who donated the wing at the DIA. Of course, Jonathan and I were considering something similar before the divorce." The lie rolled off her tongue like honey laced with arsenic. Jonathan had left her precisely because of her spending habits, but Victoria had learned that in Detroit's resurgent cultural scene, perception was everything. She clutched her complimentary ticket between manicured fingers, the ticket she'd browbeaten young Timothy Walsh into providing after cornering him in the development office. "I contribute significantly to the arts," she'd informed the stammering intern, though her last charitable donation had been a tax write-off for clothes she'd grown tired of. "Excuse me, ma'am." Victoria turned at the quiet voice, her expression shifting from practiced charm to barely concealed irritation. A teenage boy stood behind her, white cane in hand, wearing a simple navy blazer that had clearly seen better days. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his posture carried a dignity that somehow made Victoria's designer outfit feel like costume jewelry. "Yes." The word emerged as a verbal ice cube. "I believe you're standing in the accessible seating area," Marcus Williams said politely. His voice carried the careful cadence of someone who'd learned to navigate the world through sound and touch. "The tactile markers on the floor indicate, tactile markers." Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Several nearby conversations paused as heads turned. "Sweetheart, I paid good money to be here. I don't know what charity brought you, but this is the VIP reception area." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd felt the raised dots under his feet, memorized the layout during his orientation with Elena last week. This was exactly where he was supposed to be, where his father had requested he wait before the announcement. But experience had taught him that explaining often made things worse. "I understand," he said quietly. "I was just what? Looking for a handout." Victoria's voice rose another octave. "Security," she called, waving her program in the air like a weapon. "We have someone here who doesn't belong." The conversations around them had stopped entirely now. Victoria felt the delicious weight of attention, the familiar rush of being the center of the drama. She'd been playing these scenes since prep school, the righteous defender of order against chaos, the protector of standards against decline. "Ma'am, perhaps we could," Elena Rodriguez appeared at Marcus's side, her prosthetic leg clicking softly against the marble as she moved. Her theater ID badge caught the light, Elena Rodriguez, Accessibility Coordinator. "Oh, wonderful," Victoria sneered. "The whole charity delegation is here. Listen, I don't know what kind of feel-good story you're running tonight, but this is a serious cultural institution, not a halfway house." Elena's hand found Marcus's shoulder, a steady anchor in the growing storm of whispers and stares. She'd watched this exact scene play out before, always the same type of person, always the same assumptions, always the same vicious confidence that money granted the right to humiliate others. "Mrs. Elena kept her voice level, professional. "Ashfordson. Victoria Ashfordson. And it's not Mrs. anymore, thank God. I'm quite independent now." Another calculated revelation designed to signal her availability to the right sort of man. "Now, I really must insist that you move your project along. Some of us are here for the actual performance." Marcus felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried since losing his sight 5 years ago, not the blindness itself, but the assumption that blindness meant helplessness, meant charity case, meant less than. He thought of his father's calloused hands teaching him to read blueprints in Braille, of the construction sites where he'd learned to navigate by sound and smell, of the workers who'd grown to respect his ability to catch structural problems they'd missed. The performance, Marcus said quietly, is Phantom of the Opera. Yes, obviously. Victoria's tone suggested she was dealing with a particularly slow child. Andrew Lloyd Webber's 1986 musical, based on Gaston Leroux's 1910 novel. The original London production opened October 9, 1986, at Her Majesty's Theatre. Michael Crawford originated the title role, with Sarah Brightman as Christine. Marcus's voice carried the precise cadence of someone who lived and breathed musical theatre. This is the 2019 touring production featuring Derek Klena, who played Eddie in the passing Strange revival. The lobby had gone dead quiet now, the only sounds the distant rumble of Detroit traffic and the soft whisper of expensive fabric as people shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's face flushed red beneath her foundation. The boy was showing off, trying to prove something. Worse, he was making her look foolish in front of people whose opinions mattered. Anyone can memorize Wikipedia, she snapped. That doesn't give you the right to. He can't see the seat. The new voice came from across the lobby, where James Williams stood frozen in the doorway. He was a large man, built like the construction sites he'd spent his life on, his hands bearing the permanent stains of honest work. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored but somehow looked uncomfortable on his frame, as if he were more used to hard hats than formal wear. Marcus turned toward his father's voice, and Victoria followed his gaze, her irritation deepening. Another charity case, clearly. Probably the boy's handler or social worker. He can't see the seat. James repeated, his voice carrying the distinctive rumble of a man who'd learned to project over heavy machinery. And you're telling him he doesn't belong here? In a theater where every single accessibility modification was installed by my company, with my money, because of my son's needs? Victoria's brain scrambled to process the implications. She looked back at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. The quiet dignity, the encyclopedic knowledge, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. Not a charity case. Not a project. Your son, she repeated faintly. My son, James confirmed, moving across the lobby with purpose. Marcus Williams. Who happens to know more about theater than most of the donors in this room. Who can tell you the load-bearing specifications of every beam in this building because he helped design the accessibility renovations. Who's been attending performances here since he was 12 years old. Elena felt the shift in the room's energy, the way power dynamics could flip in an instant. She'd seen James Williams in action before, quiet until provoked, but devastating once roused. Victoria Ashfordson had just picked the wrong family to humiliate. I had no idea, Victoria stammered, but her tone carried more indignation than apology. Well, he should have said something. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to assume anything, Elena said quietly. That's the point. Victoria's face hardened again. Apology had never been her strong suit, and backing down felt like death. I purchased a ticket to this gala, she said, her voice rising back to its commanding pitch. I have every right to expect a certain standard. I won't be lectured by staff about how to behave in a theater I help support. Marcus tilted his head slightly, a gesture Elena recognized. He was listening, cataloging, filing away every word. Whatever was coming next, she had the distinct feeling Victoria Ashfordson wouldn't like it. A ticket you purchased, Marcus said softly. Or a complimentary ticket you pressured an intern into providing. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around them, the pre-show reception continued its careful choreography of networking and status display, but their small circle had become its own universe of tension and consequence. The first bell chimed, signaling 15 minutes to curtain. In the distance, the orchestra began their warm-up, violins soaring toward the domed ceiling like prayers made audible. But in the marble lobby of the Fisher Theater, 3 people stood locked in a moment that would reshape all their lives. Marcus Williams, blind teenager with perfect pitch and blueprints memorized in Braille, waited with the infinite patience of someone who'd learned that the world would eventually reveal its secrets to those who listened carefully enough. Victoria Ashfordshire, pharmaceutical heiress in borrowed dignity, felt the first crack in the armor of her assumed superiority. And somewhere in the shadows of the grand staircase, Elena Rodriguez made a mental note to update her discrimination documentation files. She had a feeling she was going to need them. 3 months earlier, Elena Rodriguez had learned to recognize the sound of trouble approaching. It wasn't the obvious clatter of dropped programs or the sharp intake of breath that preceded a patron's complaint. Trouble wore designer heels and spoke in the carefully modulated tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need to speak with someone in charge," Victoria Ashfordshire had announced on her first visit to the Fisher Theater, her voice carrying across the accessibility office like a declaration of war. "There seems to be some confusion about seating arrangements." Elena had looked up from her computer, where she'd been reviewing the latest audio description equipment specifications. The woman standing in her doorway was everything the Fisher's diversity training warned about: expensively dressed, aggressively entitled, and radiating the particular brand of impatience that came with never having been told no in any meaningful way. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, Accessibility Coordinator. How can I help you?" Finally. Someone with a title. Victoria had swept into the office uninvited, her gaze immediately cataloging and dismissing the modest space. "I attended the Gershwin tribute last week, and I was shocked, to find my view blocked by some sort of equipment. These audio things for the..." She'd waved her hand vaguely, as if the word disabled might soil her manicured fingers. Elena had felt her jaw tighten. Audio description devices. They help patrons with visual impairments follow the performance. "Yes, well, that's very charitable, I'm sure, but I paid full price for premium seating. I shouldn't have to accommodate other people's limitations when I'm supporting the arts." That conversation had been the first entry in Elena's documentation file. What she couldn't have known was that it was also the first step in a trap that had been set long before Victoria Ashfordshire ever darkened the Fisher Theater's doors. The trap had actually begun 2 years earlier, in James Williams's downtown office. The space occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse, its industrial aesthetic softened by Marcus's influence: tactile art pieces, a braille-labeled sound system, furniture arranged with mathematical precision to accommodate navigation by touch. "I want to buy the Fisher," James had told his lawyer, David Chen, no relation to Victoria, despite sharing a surname that would later fuel her social climbing fantasies. David had nearly choked on his coffee. "The Fisher Theater? James, that's a $30 million acquisition. And it's not even for sale." "Everything's for sale if you find the right pressure point." James had pulled out a folder thick with financial documents. "The theater's been hemorrhaging money since the pandemic. Board split between selling to developers and finding a white knight investor. I want to be that investor." "Why?" David had known James Williams for 15 years, had watched him build his construction company from a single truck to a multi-million-dollar operation. But James wasn't sentimental about buildings. He built them, renovated them, and moved on. James had walked to the window, where downtown Detroit spread out below them like a blueprint come to life. Marcus lost his sight in that car accident when he was 12. "You know what the first thing he asked me was, when he got out of the hospital?" David had waited. He wanted to know if he'd still be able to go to the theater. Not whether he'd walk again, not whether he'd see again. Whether he could still experience live performance. James's voice had carried the weight of a father's grief transformed into purpose. "I spent the next month calling every major venue in Michigan. You know how many had real accessibility? Not compliance check boxes, but actual accommodation. I'm guessing not many. 3. 3 venues in the entire state that treated disabled patrons like customers instead of charity cases. James had turned back to David, his expression set in the stubborn lines that had carried him through 2 decades of construction challenges. I'm going to fix that. Starting with the Fisher. The acquisition had taken 18 months of delicate maneuvering. James had worked through shell companies and silent partnerships, approaching the Fisher's board not as a construction magnate looking for a vanity project, but as an anonymous donor concerned about arts accessibility. The beauty of the strategy was its truth. He genuinely cared about accessibility. He just happened to also have the resources to enforce that caring on an institutional level. Elena had been hired 6 months into the transition, brought in specifically because of her military background and her uncompromising approach to inclusion. Her first week on the job, she'd received a call from the theater's mysterious benefactor. Ms. Rodriguez? This is, well, let's say I'm someone with a strong interest in the Fisher's accessibility improvements. Elena had recognized the voice immediately. She'd been Marcus's orientation instructor 2 years earlier, had watched James Williams learn to navigate a world suddenly hostile to his son's needs. But she'd followed his lead, maintaining the fiction of anonymity. How can I help you? I understand you've been documenting accessibility violations. It's part of my job description. The ADA requires, I'm not talking about legal compliance. I'm talking about dignity violations. The small cruelties. The assumptions. James's voice had carried a quiet intensity that Elena recognized from her military days, the tone of someone planning a long-term campaign. I want you to document everything. Every slight, every microaggression, every moment when someone treats our disabled patrons like inconveniences instead of customers. That's not typically part of accessibility coordination. It is now. I'm establishing a foundation. The Marcus Williams Foundation for Arts Accessibility. When we go public, I want documentation that shows exactly why this work matters. Elena had started the files that day. Victoria Ashfordson had been her most prolific subject, though she'd hardly been alone. The documentation had grown thick with incident reports, email exchanges, and recorded conversations that painted a comprehensive picture of systemic prejudice disguised as social grace. The breakthrough had come 6 weeks ago, when Victoria had made the mistake of putting her prejudice in writing. Timothy Walsh, the development office intern, had forwarded Elena an email chain that made her hands shake with anger. Victoria had been demanding complimentary tickets to the Foundation's inaugural gala, the event James planned to use for the public announcement of his ownership and the Foundation's mission. Timothy, Victoria's initial email had read, I trust you can arrange VIP seating for the upcoming gala. As someone who contributes significantly to Detroit's cultural landscape, I expect accommodation appropriate to my status. Please ensure I'm seated away from any accessibility patrons. I find their presence disruptive to the artistic experience. Timothy had responded professionally, explaining that the gala was specifically celebrating accessibility improvements and that all patrons would be seated according to their needs and preferences. Victoria's reply had been a masterpiece of entitled fury. I don't care what the theme is. I pay for premium experiences, not feel-good publicity stunts. If you can't guarantee proper seating away from wheelchairs and other equipment, then perhaps I should reconsider my future support. I'm sure the board would be interested to know that donor preferences aren't being respected. Elena had forwarded the email chain to James immediately, along with her growing file of Victoria's documented behavior. His response had been a single sentence. Perfect. Make sure she gets exactly what she's asking for. The plan had crystallized from there. Victoria would receive her complimentary tickets, VIP seating at the gala, exactly as requested. She would be placed in the most prominent location possible, where her behavior would be visible to Detroit's cultural elite and, more importantly, to the media covering the foundation's announcement. Elena had spent weeks preparing the ground. She'd briefed the security staff on potential scenarios, arranged for discreet recording equipment in the lobby and reception areas, and coordinated with local disability rights advocates who would be attending the gala. Most importantly, she'd convinced James to bring Marcus to the event, something he'd been reluctant to do, knowing his son's preference for avoiding crowds and attention. She needs to see what she's really attacking, Elena had argued. Not the idea of disabled people, but an actual person. Someone brilliant and accomplished and completely undeserving of her cruelty. I won't use my son as bait. You're not. You're giving him the chance to attend a celebration of everything you've built in his honor. And if someone chooses to behave badly in his presence, that's on them, not on you. The final piece had fallen into place just days before the gala, when Elena had learned about Victoria's divorce proceedings. The pharmaceutical heiress was hemorrhaging money on legal fees and luxury expenses, desperately trying to maintain a lifestyle her settlement couldn't actually support. Her aggressive pursuit of free tickets and VIP treatment suddenly made perfect sense. She was performing wealth she no longer possessed, attacking others to deflect from her own insecurity. Now, standing in the Fisher Theatre lobby as Victoria Ashfordson revealed herself to be exactly as petty and cruel as Elena's documentation suggested, the accessibility coordinator felt the grim satisfaction of a trap closing exactly as planned. Marcus stood quietly beside his father, unaware that months of careful preparation had led to this moment. He knew only that he was attending a gala in his honor, that the Fisher Theatre now welcomed patrons like him with genuine respect rather than grudging accommodation. Victoria continued her tirade, each word adding weight to the evidence Elena had been collecting. Around them, Detroit's cultural elite watched with growing discomfort as one of their number revealed the ugly prejudice lurking beneath the surface of charitable giving and social responsibility. In her pocket, Elena's phone recorded every word, adding to a file that would soon transform from documentation into evidence. The Marcus Williams Foundation for Arts Accessibility was about to go public in the most dramatic way possible, with its namesake serving as both inspiration and witness to the kind of treatment that made such foundations necessary. The trap was set. The prey was cooperating beautifully. And somewhere in the orchestra pit, musicians tuned their instruments for a performance that would pale in comparison to the drama unfolding in the lobby. What moment in this confrontation made your blood boil the most? Victoria's assumption about charity cases, her dismissal of accessibility needs, or her demand for proper seating away from disabled patrons? Let us know in the comments what caught your attention. These real attitudes exist in our communities every day. The second bell chimed through the Fisher Theatre lobby, its bronze notes reverberating off marble columns that had witnessed Detroit's rise, fall, and resurrection. 10 minutes to curtain. The reception crowd began its elegant migration toward the theater doors, champagne glasses surrendered to white-gloved servers, programs rustling like autumn leaves as conversations shifted from networking to anticipation. Victoria Ashfordson remained planted in the center of the accessibility area, her Louboutin heels positioned like a general claiming territory. The revelation that Marcus was James Williams's son had only intensified her indignation rather than tempering it. In her worldview, privilege came with the obligation to behave appropriately, and calling out her behavior in public was the height of impropriety. "I don't care whose son he is," she announced, her voice carrying across the now sparse lobby. "The fact remains that I paid for a premium experience, and I shouldn't have to explain myself to anyone. This is exactly what's wrong with society today. Everyone thinks they're entitled to special treatment." Elena felt her phone buzzing silently in her pocket, text messages from board members, donors, and staff who'd witnessed the confrontation. The Fisher's reputation for inclusive excellence was being tested in real time, and everyone knew it. Marcus turned his head slightly toward Victoria's voice, a gesture Elena recognized from their training sessions. He was mapping the room acoustically, processing the number of people still present, the distance to exits, the shifting dynamics of attention and power. What most people read as nervousness was actually tactical assessment. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who'd learned that words mattered more when you couldn't rely on visual cues to convey meaning. "I'd like to understand what you think I'm asking for." "Excuse me?" Victoria's tone suggested the question was an impertinence. "Special treatment. You said everyone thinks they're entitled to special treatment. I'd like to know what you think I'm asking for that special." James stepped closer to his son, recognizing the dangerous calm in Marcus's voice. He'd heard it before, when contractors assumed Marcus couldn't understand technical specifications, when teachers suggested he might be more comfortable in alternative programs, when well-meaning strangers spoke to James instead of directly to his son. "You're asking to be accommodated," Victoria replied, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "To have the world rearranged because of your condition." "My condition," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "You mean my blindness? If that's what you want to call it. That's what it's called. I'm blind." Marcus's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "I lost my sight in a car accident when I was 12. Traumatic optic neuropathy, if you want the medical terminology. And you're right, I do need accommodation." Victoria's posture straightened, vindicated. "I need the world to be navigable without sight," Marcus continued. "Which is why my father's company installed tactile guidance systems throughout this theater. Raised dots and textured surfaces that help me move independently. I need audio description for visual elements of performances, which is why every seat in this theater now has access to assistive listening devices. I need digital programs in accessible formats, which is why the Fisher now provides braille, large print, and audio versions of all materials." Elena watched Victoria's expression shift as the implications became clear. Every accessibility feature Marcus mentioned represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in renovations. The accommodations Victoria was dismissing weren't charity handouts, they were infrastructure investments that had transformed the Fisher Theater into a model of inclusive design. "But here's what I'm not asking for," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm not asking for lower standards. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not asking to be treated like a charity case or a feel-good story. I'm asking to be treated like a customer who paid for a service and deserves to receive it without being made to feel like my presence is an inconvenience." "You didn't pay," Victoria snapped. "Your father paid. There's a difference." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the few remaining patrons had gone silent, sensing the shift from mere rudeness to something approaching cruelty. James Williams felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. He'd built his business on the principle that respect was earned through competence, not inherited through circumstances. His son had earned respect through intelligence, determination, and grace under pressure. Victoria Ashfordshire had earned nothing but was demanding everything. "You're right," James said quietly. "I paid. Just like you didn't pay, you bullied an intern into giving you complimentary tickets to an event you're not qualified to attend." Victoria's face flushed scarlet. "How dare you, how dare I what? Point out that you're attending a foundation gala celebrating accessibility while publicly humiliating a disabled teenager. Point out that you're claiming to support the arts while treating actual artists like inconveniences." James's voice remained level, but Elena could hear the construction site authority beneath the formal register. "You want to talk about who belongs here? Let's talk about qualifications." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages with deliberate calm. "My son has attended 47 performances at this theater over the past 5 years. He can tell you the cast, crew, and technical specifications of every show. He's volunteered with our accessibility consulting team, helping design improvements that have made this venue a national model for inclusive art spaces. He's contributed more to this institution's mission in his 17 years than most board members have in decades. That's wonderful for him, Victoria said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. But I still don't see why I should have to accommodate, because it's the law. The new voice came from the theater's main entrance, where a woman in a tailored suit approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Detective Sarah Morrison, Detroit Police Department's Community Relations Division, badge visible on her belt. Elena's emergency contact, summoned by a discreet text message 20 minutes earlier. Ma'am, I'm Detective Morrison. I've received reports of a possible harassment incident involving a disabled patron. Victoria's confidence faltered for the first time all evening. Harassment? I was simply requesting appropriate seating arrangements. By demanding that a patron be removed from an area he has every legal right to occupy. Detective Morrison consulted her phone, reading from Elena's text summary. By referring to accessibility equipment as equipment for those people. By characterizing a disabled teenager as a charity case taking up space, ? I never said, ma'am, this conversation has been witnessed by approximately 24 people, including several board members and at least one reporter from the Detroit Free Press. Morrison's tone remained professional, but Elena could see the steel beneath the courtesy. The Americans with Disabilities Act is quite specific about harassment of disabled individuals in public accommodations. The lobby had gone dead silent now, the only sounds the distant tuning of the orchestra and the soft hum of the building's HVAC system. Victoria looked around desperately, seeking allies or escape routes, finding neither. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice rising toward hysteria. I'm being persecuted for having standards. For expecting a certain level of decorum at cultural events. Decorum, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. Like publicly humiliating someone based on their disability? Like assuming their presence diminishes your experience? Like treating accessibility as an inconvenience rather than a civil right? Victoria's composure cracked completely. You little, careful, Detective Morrison interrupted smoothly. We're well into harassment territory already. I'd hate to add verbal assault charges. Elena felt a grim satisfaction as the trap finally snapped shut. Months of documentation, weeks of preparation, and Victoria Ashford-Chin was cooperating perfectly by revealing exactly who she was when challenged. The recording in Elena's pocket would be devastating evidence, but it was almost unnecessary. Victoria was providing live testimony to her own prejudice in front of witnesses who could destroy her social standing with a few well-placed phone calls. James Williams watched his son handle the confrontation with quiet pride. Marcus had learned to navigate a world that often saw his blindness before his humanity, and he developed the emotional intelligence to respond to cruelty with dignity that made the cruelty look even worse by comparison. Officer, Victoria said, attempting to regain control of the situation. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Victoria Ashford-Chin. My ex-husband is Jonathan Chen, of Chen Pharmaceuticals. I contribute significantly to Detroit's cultural institutions. Surely we can resolve this without involving legal complications. Detective Morrison's expression didn't change. Ma'am, the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their financial status or social connections. The question is whether you violated the civil rights of a disabled individual in a public accommodation. Your social status isn't relevant to that determination. The third bell chimed, 5 minutes to curtain. In the theater beyond the lobby doors, 2,000 seats waited for the evening's performance of Phantom of the Opera. But the real drama was unfolding in the marble lobby, where privilege and prejudice were about to meet consequences. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, dignity, and what happens when entitled people finally meet their match. The next chapter reveals just how deep this rabbit hole goes, and trust me, you won't believe what we discover about Victoria's real situation. Victoria Ashfordshire stood surrounded by the wreckage of her own making, still unaware that the worst was yet to come. In her purse, the complimentary ticket she demanded bore the logo of the Marcus Williams Foundation for Arts Accessibility, the foundation whose inauguration gala she was attending, whose mission she just spent 20 minutes publicly attacking, whose namesake she dismissed as unworthy of respect. The performance was about to begin, but the real show was just getting started. Detective Morrison's radio crackled to life as she positioned herself between Victoria and the theater's main entrance. The static-filled voice of dispatch cut through the lobby's tense silence. Unit 47, we have additional units en route for crowd control. ETA 3 minutes. Victoria's eyes widened. Crowd control. For what? This is absurd. I haven't done anything that warrants police intervention. Ma'am, when we receive reports of disability harassment at a major cultural venue, protocol requires a full response, Morrison explained, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who dealt with entitled suspects before. The Fisher Theatre hosts over 300,000 patrons annually. Any incident that compromises the safety or dignity of disabled guests becomes a matter of public accommodation law. Elena watched the color drain from Victoria's face as the implications began to sink in. What had started as casual cruelty was now an official police matter, complete with incident reports that would become part of the public record. In Detroit's tight-knit cultural community, reputation was everything, and Victoria's was being destroyed in real time. I want to speak to the theater's management, Victoria demanded, her voice taking on the shrill edge of panic poorly disguised as authority. Someone with actual authority, not security personnel or... She gestured dismissively at Elena, accessibility coordinators. I am the management. The new voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to boardroom battles and municipal politics. Margaret Sinclair, the Fisher Theatre's executive director, approached from the administrative wing with the measured pace of someone who'd been watching the situation unfold from the mezzanine level. At 62, she'd survived 3 decades of Detroit's cultural renaissance by developing an unerring instinct for when institutional reputation was at stake. Mrs. Sinclair, Victoria's relief was palpable. Finally, someone who understands the situation. I was simply trying to ensure appropriate seating arrangements when this misunderstanding got blown out of proportion. Margaret's expression remained neutral as she consulted the tablet in her hand. Ms. Ashfordshire, I've been reviewing your interactions with our staff over the past several months. Would you like to discuss them? My interactions? I've been nothing but supportive of this institution. According to our records, you've filed 17 separate complaints about accessibility accommodations since March. You've demanded refunds for performances where disabled patrons were seated in your sight lines. You've submitted written requests for disability-free seating sections. Margaret's voice remained professionally calm, but Elena could hear the steel beneath the courtesy. Most recently, you threatened to report our development intern to the board for refusing to guarantee seating away from wheelchairs and other equipment. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She'd assumed her complaints were confidential, processed by low-level staff who lacked the authority or motivation to compile patterns. The realization that her behavior had been systematically documented was clearly a shock. Those were concerns about the artistic experience, she stammered. I have a right to express preferences about seating. You have the right to request seating that meets your access needs, Detective Morrison interjected, consulting her notes. You don't have the right to demand seating that excludes other patrons based on their disability status. That's discrimination, and it's a federal crime. The radio crackled again, units arriving on scene. Should we maintain perimeter or proceed to contact? Morrison keyed her radio. Maintain perimeter. We're conducting a preliminary investigation. Victoria's panic spiked visibly. Investigation? This is harassment. I'm being persecuted for having opinions about theater management. No ma'am, Morrison replied calmly. You're being investigated for potentially violating the civil rights of a disabled individual. There's a significant difference. James Williams had remained silent during this exchange, watching Victoria's composure disintegrate as the institutional machinery of accountability began to engage. He'd seen this pattern before: contractors who cut corners on safety, inspectors who overlooked violations, officials who assumed their authority made them untouchable. They all shared the same shocked bewilderment when consequences finally arrived. Ms. Ashfordshire, Margaret continued, I think it's important you understand the current situation. This building is owned by the Marcus Williams Foundation for Arts Accessibility, which exists specifically to ensure that disabled patrons receive equal treatment at cultural venues. The Foundation's board includes disability rights attorneys, federal accessibility consultants, and advocacy organizations that monitor compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Victoria looked confused. The Marcus Williams Foundation? Named for the young man you've spent the last 30 minutes publicly humiliating, Margaret gestured toward Marcus, who stood quietly beside his father. The Foundation's inaugural gala is beginning in approximately 2 minutes. The gala you're attending on complimentary tickets, celebrating the very accessibility improvements you've spent months complaining about. Elena watched the final pieces click into place behind Victoria's eyes. The complimentary tickets she'd demanded, the VIP seating she'd insisted upon, the gala celebrating accessibility. She was attending an event honoring the teenager she'd just dismissed as a charity case, funded by the father she'd accused of enabling his son's entitlement. I didn't know, Victoria whispered. You didn't know because you didn't care to know, Elena said quietly. You saw a disabled teenager and made assumptions. You saw accessibility equipment and demanded to be seated away from it. You saw inclusion and called it special treatment. Detective Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent update. Detective Morrison, we have media arriving on scene. Channel 7, Detroit Free Press, and what looks like social media influencers. Should we establish a media perimeter? Victoria's face went ashen. Media? Why is there media? Margaret consulted her tablet again. Because tonight's gala is the public launch of a $50 million accessibility initiative that will transform cultural venues across the Midwest. The Marcus Williams Foundation's announcement has been anticipated by disability rights organizations, urban development agencies, and arts communities throughout the region. 50 million. Victoria's voice was barely audible. The Foundation's initial commitment, yes. Funded entirely by Mr. Williams's construction company and managed by a board of accessibility experts and legal advocates. Margaret's tone remained professional, but Elena could see satisfaction in her eyes. Tonight's event will announce grants to 12 additional venues, employment initiatives for disabled arts professionals, and legal support for discrimination victims. The implications were staggering. Victoria had publicly attacked not just a disabled teenager, but the heir to a foundation dedicated to fighting exactly the kind of prejudice she'd displayed. Her behavior would be documented not as an isolated incident, but as a case study in the attitudes the foundation existed to combat. I want to leave, Victoria said suddenly. I want to leave right now. Ma'am, you're free to go, Detective Morrison replied. But I should inform you that this incident will be included in our report, and depending on witness statements, charges may be filed. Charges? Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. For what? Harassment based on disability status is a misdemeanor under Michigan law. Interference with the civil rights of disabled individuals in public accommodations can be prosecuted under federal statute. The specific charges would depend on witness testimony and evidence review. Elena felt her phone buzzing with notifications, texts, emails, and app alerts that suggested word of the confrontation was already spreading through Detroit's interconnected cultural community. The Fisher Theatre's board members, donors, and staff were witnessing Victoria's meltdown in real time, and social media was beginning to pick up the story. "This is insane," Victoria said, looking around desperately for support or escape routes. "I came to a theater gala. I expressed concerns about seating arrangements. I'm being treated like a criminal for having standards." Marcus spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Ma'am, you didn't express concerns about seating. You demanded that I be removed from a public space because of my disability. You characterized accessibility equipment as disruptive to your experience. You dismissed my presence as charity that diminished the artistic atmosphere." "Those weren't your exact words," Victoria protested weakly. "Would you like me to repeat your exact words?" Marcus's question carried no malice, just genuine curiosity. "I have an eidetic memory for audio. I can reproduce this entire conversation verbatim if you'd prefer accuracy to interpretation." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria realized, perhaps for the first time, that her casual cruelty had been witnessed, recorded, and could be reproduced with perfect accuracy by someone she'd assumed was intellectually inferior. Around them, the lobby had emptied as the last patrons entered the theater. The only sounds were the soft conversations of police officers coordinating their response and the distant overture beginning beyond the closed theater doors. But in the marble space where Victoria Ashfordshire had expected to enjoy an evening of cultural superiority, she found herself facing the consequences of assumptions that had seemed safe just an hour earlier. The investigation was just beginning, but the damage to her reputation was already irreversible. In Detroit's cultural community, where relationships and respect mattered more than money, Victoria had just revealed herself to be someone who attacked disabled teenagers for sport. The performance of Phantom of the Opera was about to begin, but the real Phantom, the specter of prejudice that haunted even progressive institutions, was being dragged into the light. Detective Morrison pulled out a digital recording device, its red light blinking steadily in the marble lobby's crystal light. "Ms. Ashfordshire, before we proceed, I want you to understand that everything you've said in this public space has been recorded by the theater's security system. Additionally, Ms. Rodriguez has been documenting this interaction as part of her official duties as accessibility coordinator." Elena reached into her jacket pocket, withdrawing her phone and a small digital recorder. The Fisher Theatre maintains comprehensive documentation of all accessibility-related incidents. It's required by our insurance carrier and our federal compliance agreements. Victoria's eyes darted between the devices, finally understanding that her words weren't just disappearing into the air, they were becoming evidence. "You can't record people without their consent. That's illegal." "Actually," Margaret Sinclair interjected, consulting her tablet, "Michigan is a one-party consent state for audio recording in public spaces. The Fisher Theatre's terms of service, which you agreed to when you entered the building, explicitly state that interactions with staff may be recorded for training and legal purposes. You received a copy of those terms with your complimentary tickets." Detective Morrison nodded toward Elena. "Ms. Rodriguez, would you please share the documentation you've compiled regarding Ms. Ashfordshire's previous interactions with theater staff?" Elena opened her phone, scrolling through months of carefully organized files. "I have 17 separate incident reports spanning 14 weeks, including audio recordings of 6 phone conversations, copies of 12 emails, and witness statements from 8 staff members." Victoria's face went white. That's stalking. "You've been spying on me." "I've been documenting discrimination complaints and harassment incidents involving disabled patrons, as required by my position," Elena replied calmly. "You happen to be our most prolific subject." She began reading from her files. March 15, 2:30 p.m. Subject called requesting disability-free seating for the spring musical season. When informed that we don't segregate patrons based on disability status, subject became belligerent and demanded to speak to someone who understands customer service. I was asking for accommodation of my preferences, Victoria protested. Elena continued, March 18, 10:15 a.m. Subject appeared in person, demanding refund for previous evening's performance. Complained that wheelchair patrons blocked her view of the stage and that audio equipment for blind people was distracting. When informed that accessible seating is distributed throughout the theater to prevent segregation, subject stated, and I quote, "I don't care about their rights. I care about my experience." Detective Morrison made notes on her pad. Did you record that conversation? Yes. Theater policy requires recording of all complaint interactions. Elena tapped her phone screen. Would you like to hear it? No. Victoria said quickly. I mean, that's not necessary. It was taken out of context. March 23, Elena continued, email to our development office. Subject wrote, I demand seating arrangements that reflect donor priorities. I shouldn't have to look at wheelchairs, service dogs, or other disability equipment during performances I'm paying to attend. This isn't a charity ward. James Williams spoke for the first time since Morrison's arrival. You called our theater a charity ward. I was expressing legitimate concerns about the ambience. April 8, Elena interrupted, recorded phone conversation with our box office manager. Subject stated, I don't understand why normal people have to accommodate handicapped people. They should have their own theaters. When informed that separate facilities would constitute illegal segregation, subject replied, then maybe they should stay home. The lobby fell silent except for the distant music from the theater. Even Detective Morrison looked shocked by the casual cruelty documented in Elena's files. That's enough, Victoria said desperately. You're making me sound like some kind of monster. I'm reading your exact words, Elena replied. But we're not finished. May 12, email to our executive director, that would be Ms. Sinclair, demanding that we reconsider our accessibility policies, because they were diminishing the cultural experience for premium patrons. Margaret nodded grimly. I remember that email. You threatened to organize donor boycotts if we didn't create appropriate separation between disabled and non-disabled patrons. Elena scrolled further through her files. May 20, complaint about audio description headsets being ugly and obvious. You suggested we required disabled patrons to wear them in a way that would be less visually intrusive to other audience members. I was thinking about aesthetics. June 3, Elena continued relentlessly, recorded conversation with our facilities manager. You demanded that we install discrete accessibility sections that would be out of sight from premium seating areas. When informed that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires integrated seating, you said, and I quote, then the law is stupid and needs to change. Detective Morrison looked up from her notes. Ma'am, you stated that disability rights laws should be changed to accommodate your preferences. That was a private conversation, Victoria stammered. Nothing is private when you're discussing potential civil rights violations with institutional representatives, Morrison replied. Ms. Rodriguez, please continue. Elena had saved the worst for last. 2 weeks ago, email exchange with our development intern, Timothy Walsh. Subject demanded complimentary VIP tickets to tonight's gala, stating, I expect seating away from wheelchairs, blind people with their equipment, and other accessibility distractions. This is supposed to be a high-class event, not a special needs convention. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus tilted his head slightly, the gesture Elena recognized as his way of processing particularly shocking information. Special needs convention, Marcus repeated quietly. That's how you described a gala celebrating accessibility improvements. I didn't mean, And then yesterday, Elena continued, when Timothy explained that tonight's event was specifically honoring the Marcus Williams Foundation's accessibility work, you replied, "I don't care what foundation it's honoring. I paid for premium treatment and I expect it. Make sure those people are seated somewhere else." Detective Morrison finished writing and looked up at Victoria. "Ma'am, are you disputing the accuracy of these documented statements?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She couldn't deny statements that had been recorded and documented by multiple witnesses over months of interactions. "The pattern is quite clear," Margaret observed, consulting her own files. Systematic harassment of disabled patrons, demands for segregated seating, threats against staff who enforce anti-discrimination policies, and explicit statements opposing disability rights legislation. Elena pulled up one final file on her phone. And tonight's interaction, beginning at 7:45 p.m., when subject approached Marcus Williams, the foundation's namesake, and demanded his removal from the accessibility seating area where he was lawfully positioned. She began playing the audio recording from her phone. Victoria's voice emerged with crystal clarity, "Sweetheart, I paid good money to be here. I don't know what charity brought you, but this is the VIP reception area." The recording continued, capturing every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty, every assumption that Marcus's presence diminished the evening's elegance. Victoria's own words played back in the marble lobby, her prejudice preserved in digital amber for everyone to hear. That's selective editing," Victoria protested weakly as her recorded voice continued its litany of discrimination. "It's a continuous recording," Elena replied. "No editing, no cuts, no manipulation. Just your actual words, in sequence, with timestamps verified by the theater's security system." Detective Morrison finished listening and made final notes. Ms. Ashfordshire, based on this documentation and tonight's witnessed events, I'm classifying this as a harassment incident under Michigan's Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act and potential federal civil rights violations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. "But I never touched anyone," Victoria said desperately. "I never threatened violence." "Harassment doesn't require physical contact," Morrison explained. "Verbal harassment, creation of hostile environments for disabled individuals, and interference with equal access to public accommodations are all criminal offenses." Elena felt a grim satisfaction as months of documentation transformed into legal consequences. Victoria had assumed her behavior existed in a consequence-free bubble, that her wealth and social status would shield her from accountability. But evidence was evidence, and patterns of discrimination couldn't be dismissed or explained away. James Williams watched his son process the revelation that his casual humiliation had been part of a documented pattern spanning months. Marcus's expression remained composed, but James could see the hurt beneath the dignity, the realization that tonight's cruelty hadn't been spontaneous rudeness but calculated prejudice. "The Foundation's legal team will be very interested in this documentation," Margaret noted. "Systematic harassment of disabled patrons at cultural venues is exactly the kind of discrimination the Marcus Williams Foundation was created to combat." Victoria looked around desperately, seeking escape routes or allies, finding neither. The lobby that had seemed like her natural domain just an hour earlier now felt like a courtroom where she was the sole defendant facing a mountain of evidence. The recording devices continued their quiet documentation, preserving every word for the legal proceedings that seemed increasingly inevitable. In the theater beyond, the phantom's voice soared toward the domed ceiling, but in the marble lobby, a different kind of phantom was being exposed, the specter of prejudice that lurked beneath the surface of polite society. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was undeniable. And Victoria Ashfordshire was about to discover that actions, even verbal ones, had consequences. Detective Morrison closed her notepad with the decisive snap that marked the end of a preliminary investigation and the beginning of formal proceedings. Ms. Ashfordshire, based on the documented evidence and witnessed events, I'm placing you under arrest for harassment of a disabled individual in a public accommodation." The words seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stepped backward, her designer heel catching on the marble floor's tactile guidance strip, the very accessibility feature she'd spent months complaining about. "Arrest? You can't arrest me for expressing opinions." "You're not being arrested for opinions," Morrison replied, producing handcuffs from her belt with practiced efficiency. "You're being arrested for systematic harassment based on disability status, creation of a hostile environment for disabled patrons, and interference with equal access to public accommodations." Elena watched Victoria's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and dawning terror as the reality of criminal consequences settled in. Around them, the theater's security team maintained discreet positions near the exits while Morrison's backup officers coordinated crowd control outside. The Fisher Theater's marble lobby, designed to showcase Detroit's cultural renaissance, had become an impromptu arrest scene. "This is insane," Victoria said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "I have rights. I have connections. My attorney, you have the right to remain silent," Morrison began, approaching with the handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." "I can afford my own attorney," Victoria shrieked, pulling away from Morrison's approach. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I'm worth?" Margaret Sinclair consulted her tablet, where social media notifications were accumulating rapidly. "Actually, Ms. Ashfordson, according to recent Detroit Business Journal reporting, your divorce settlement is being contested by creditors, and your ex-husband's pharmaceutical company is under federal investigation for Medicare fraud. Your financial situation appears to be considerably more precarious than you've represented." Victoria's face went ashen. The carefully constructed facade of wealth and status she'd maintained since her divorce was crumbling in real time, exposed by the same institutional scrutiny she'd assumed would never touch her. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Morrison instructed, her tone carrying the authority of someone who'd arrested hundreds of suspects who thought their money made them untouchable. "No," Victoria said, backing toward the theater doors. "I'm not doing this. I'm leaving. I'm going home and calling my lawyer and having all of you sued for harassment." "Ma'am, you're under arrest. Attempting to flee will result in additional charges." Elena felt her phone buzzing frantically with notifications as word of the arrest spread through Detroit's cultural community. Board members, donors, and arts advocates were sharing updates in real time, the story viral before the handcuffs were even applied. James Williams stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Detective Morrison, I want to be clear about something. My family doesn't want revenge. We want accountability. Ms. Ashfordson has spent months terrorizing disabled patrons at this theater, and tonight she targeted my son specifically because she assumed he couldn't fight back." Victoria spun toward James, her composure finally shattering completely. "Your son is fine. Nothing happened to him. He's standing right there, perfectly safe." "Something did happen to him," Elena said quietly. "He was publicly humiliated by someone who assumed his disability made him vulnerable to attack. He was dismissed as a charity case, told he didn't belong in a theater his family owns, treated like his presence was an inconvenience to people who mattered more." Marcus spoke for the first time since the arrest began, his voice carrying the quiet strength Elena remembered from their training sessions. "Ma'am, you didn't just hurt me tonight. You hurt every disabled person who has to wonder whether they're welcome in public spaces. You reinforced every cruel assumption about our worth and our place in society." "I never said you weren't welcome," Victoria protested desperately. "You said I was a charity case taking up space," Marcus replied with devastating accuracy. "You said disabled patrons should be seated somewhere else so we wouldn't interfere with the experiences of people like you. You called accessibility equipment distracting and suggested we should stay home rather than inconvenience non-disabled theatergoers. Detective Morrison had heard enough. Ma'am, final warning. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, or I'll add resisting arrest to the charges. Victoria looked around wildly, seeking intervention from Margaret, Elena, or James, anyone with the authority to make this nightmare stop. But the institutional machinery of justice was in motion, and her social connections couldn't override documented evidence of civil rights violations. This will destroy me, she whispered, finally turning around and extending her hands. You destroyed yourself, Elena replied as Morrison applied the handcuffs. We just documented it. The metallic click of the restraints closing echoed through the marble lobby like a gavel falling. Victoria Ashfordshire, pharmaceutical heiress and self-appointed guardian of cultural standards, was now Victoria Ashfordshire, arrested suspect in a disability rights case that would make headlines across Michigan. Ms. Ashfordshire, Morrison said as she checked the handcuffs fit, you're being transported to Detroit Police Headquarters for booking and processing. Your attorney can meet you there. Wait, Victoria said, panic replacing rage in her voice. What about my car? My purse? I can't just leave everything, your vehicle will be impounded if it's illegally parked. Your personal effects will be inventoried and secured according to standard procedures. Morrison's tone remained professionally neutral, but Elena could see satisfaction in her eyes. The theater staff will coordinate with our property division. Elena watched Victoria's carefully constructed evening disintegrate into bureaucratic procedure. The woman who demanded VIP treatment and premium accommodations was about to experience the criminal justice system's standardized processing, fingerprinting, photographing, and cataloging like any other suspect. The media is going to have a field day with this, Margaret observed, scrolling through rapidly accumulating social media posts. Pharmaceutical heiress arrested for disability harassment at accessibility gala. It writes itself. Victoria's knees nearly buckled as the full implications hit her. Criminal charges were just the beginning, the social and professional consequences would be devastating. Detroit's cultural community was small and interconnected, and reputation was everything. Her behavior tonight hadn't just been documented, it had been witnessed by the very people whose opinions shaped social standing in the city. Detective Morrison, James said as the arrest party prepared to leave, I want to ensure that the Marcus Williams Foundation's legal team has access to all documentation from this case. We're committed to supporting prosecution efforts and using this incident to strengthen anti-discrimination enforcement. Morrison nodded. The prosecutor's office will coordinate with Foundation attorneys. This case will likely set important precedents for disability harassment prosecution in public accommodations. Elena felt a grim satisfaction as months of careful documentation transformed into legal precedent that could protect future victims. Victoria's cruelty would become a cautionary tale, her prejudice preserved in court records as evidence of why civil rights protections mattered. As Morrison guided Victoria toward the theater's main entrance, past the accessibility features she'd spent months attacking, the arrested woman made one final attempt at dignity. This isn't over, she called back to James and Marcus. My attorneys will appeal this. They'll expose this whole setup for what it is, entrapment designed to destroy someone for expressing legitimate concerns. Marcus tilted his head slightly, processing Victoria's words with the analytical precision Elena had observed during their training sessions. Ma'am, he said quietly, no one entrapped you. We simply gave you enough rope to hang yourself, and you chose to tie the knot. The observation hung in the air as Morrison escorted Victoria through the theater doors, past the bronze plaques commemorating the Marcus Williams Foundation's accessibility improvements, into the cool Detroit evening where patrol cars waited with flashing lights that painted the historic facade in alternating red and blue. Inside the theater, the Phantom's final notes soared toward the domed ceiling, but the real drama had concluded in the marble lobby where privilege had finally met accountability. Victoria Ashfordsh's fall was complete. From self-appointed cultural arbiter to criminal defendant, her prejudice transformed from private vice into public evidence of why institutions like the Marcus Williams Foundation existed. The handcuffs were just the beginning. The real consequences would unfold in courtrooms, newspaper headlines, and social circles where her name would become synonymous with the kind of casual cruelty that civil rights laws were designed to punish. Justice, Elena reflected, sometimes looked exactly like a wealthy woman being arrested in her designer dress for attacking a teenager whose only crime was existing while disabled in a space she thought belonged exclusively to people like her. 3 weeks later, the Wayne County Circuit Courthouse bustled with the controlled chaos of a high-profile civil rights case. The Marcus Williams Foundation vs. Victoria Ashfordshire had drawn national attention from disability rights organizations, legal scholars, and media outlets covering what prosecutors were calling the most comprehensive disability harassment case in Michigan history. Elena Rodriguez sat in the gallery's accessibility section, watching Victoria's legal team scramble through last-minute motions that everyone knew were doomed to fail. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable, and the defendant's behavior so egregiously documented that even expensive attorneys couldn't construct a credible defense. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Washington," the bailiff announced as the courtroom stood in unison. Judge Washington, herself a disability rights advocate who'd lost partial mobility to multiple sclerosis, had been assigned to the case through what Elena suspected was careful judicial administration rather than random assignment. Her reputation for taking disability discrimination seriously preceded her, and Victoria's legal team had already failed in 2 attempts to request a different judge. "Please be seated," Judge Washington said, consulting the thick file before her. "We're here for final sentencing in the criminal case of People of Michigan versus Victoria Ashfordshire, as well as damages determination in the civil case Marcus Williams Foundation versus Victoria Ashfordshire." Victoria sat at the defendant's table in a conservative gray suit that Elena recognized as an attempt to project humble respectability. But 3 weeks of negative media coverage had taken their toll. Her complexion was sallow, her designer confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone watching their life disintegrate in public. "Your Honor," Victoria's attorney, a well-dressed man who'd clearly been expensive, stood to address the court. "My client wishes to address the court before sentencing." Judge Washington nodded. "Ms. Ashfordshire, you may speak." Victoria stood unsteadily, her hands shaking as she approached the podium. "Your Honor, I want to apologize for my behavior. I realize now that my words were hurtful and inappropriate. I've learned a great deal about disability rights over the past weeks, and I'm committed to making amends." Elena felt her jaw clench. Even Victoria's apology was performance, crafted by attorneys to minimize liability rather than acknowledge genuine remorse. She'd seen the defendant's social media posts before they were deleted, rants about politically correct persecution and complaints about being cancelled for having standards. "Ms. Ashfordshire," Judge Washington said, her tone neutral but penetrating, "you were offered multiple opportunities to participate in mediated resolution before criminal charges were filed. You declined. You were offered plea agreements that would have avoided jail time in exchange for community service and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. You rejected those offers and demanded a trial. What changed your mind?" Victoria's composure faltered. My attorneys advised me that the evidence was compelling." "The evidence was overwhelming," Judge Washington corrected. "And your behavior throughout these proceedings has shown no genuine remorse. Your social media posts, which were entered into evidence, include statements calling this prosecution reverse discrimination and claiming you were set up by the disability lobby. That doesn't sound like someone who's learned about civil rights." Elena watched Victoria's attorney close his eyes briefly. Clearly those social media posts had been against legal advice, but Victoria's need for validation had overridden strategic considerations. Prosecutor Jennifer Martinez rose from the state's table, where she'd been consulting with representatives from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights and the Federal Department of Justice. The case had drawn intervention from multiple agencies eager to establish precedent for disability harassment prosecution. Your Honor, the state recommends the maximum sentence allowable under Michigan's civil rights statutes, combined with substantial civil damages and mandatory education requirements. Ms. Ashford's behavior represents systematic harassment spanning months, documented refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, and public statements that demonstrate ongoing prejudice against disabled individuals. Judge Washington nodded. I've reviewed the complete record, including Ms. Rodriguez's documentation, audio recordings, email exchanges, and witness testimony. The pattern of behavior is clear and deeply troubling. She turned to address Victoria directly. Ms. Ashford, you systematically harassed disabled patrons at a major cultural institution. You demanded segregation of disabled audience members. You characterized accessibility equipment as disruptive and suggested disabled people should stay home rather than attend public performances. When confronted by a disabled teenager in a space he had every right to occupy, you publicly humiliated him based solely on his disability status. Elena glanced toward the gallery's front row, where Marcus sat with his father. The teenager's expression remained composed, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Watching Victoria's prejudice dissected in legal language was necessary for justice, but painful for the victim who'd experienced it firsthand. Furthermore, Judge Washington continued, your behavior during these proceedings demonstrates no genuine understanding of the harm you've caused. Your social media activity, recorded statements to reporters, and attempts to portray yourself as a victim of political correctness show that you view civil rights protections as inconveniences to your personal preferences. Victoria's attorney tried one final intervention. Your Honor, my client has suffered significant financial and social consequences already. Her reputation in Detroit's cultural community has been destroyed. She's lost employment opportunities and social connections. Those are natural consequences of criminal behavior, not mitigating factors, Judge Washington interrupted. When someone chooses to publicly attack disabled individuals, they accept the risk that their community will judge them accordingly. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction as Victoria's attempts to portray herself as the victim were systematically dismantled. The consequences were severe precisely because the behavior was severe, and because setting strong precedent would deter future discrimination. Therefore, Judge Washington announced, I sentence Ms. Ashford to 6 months in county jail, 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service specifically with disability rights organizations, mandatory completion of civil rights education programs, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting contact with Marcus Williams or any member of his family. Victoria's knees buckled slightly, and her attorney steadied her at the defendant's table. 6 months in jail for harassment was substantial, but the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, in the civil case, I award damages of $2.5 million to the Marcus Williams Foundation, $500,000 in compensatory damages for the documented harm to the theater's inclusive mission, and $2 million in punitive damages to deter similar behavior by others. The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs. $2.5 million would bankrupt Victoria completely, liquidating whatever remained of her divorce settlement and eliminating any possibility of maintaining her previous lifestyle. Your Honor, Victoria's attorney said desperately, my client doesn't have the financial resources to pay damages of that magnitude. Then she'll pay what she can, and the remainder will be garnished from future earnings, Judge Washington replied without sympathy. Civil rights violations have consequences, and those consequences must be meaningful enough to deter repetition. Elena watched Victoria collapse back into her chair, the weight of complete financial ruin settling over her. The woman who demanded premium treatment and VIP accommodations was about to experience the county jail's standard processing procedures, followed by years of community service under the supervision of the very disability rights organizations she'd attacked. Margaret Sinclair, representing the Fisher Theatre, stood to address the court. Your Honor, the theatre requests that Ms. Ashfordshire be permanently banned from all Fisher Theatre properties and events. Her documented behavior creates a hostile environment for disabled patrons that we cannot accept. Granted, Judge Washington said immediately. The permanent restraining order includes prohibition from Fisher Theatre properties. Elena felt the machinery of institutional accountability clicking into place. Victoria wouldn't just face criminal punishment, she'd be systematically excluded from the cultural community she tried to police, her prejudice transformed into social exile. As the bailiff prepared Victoria for immediate transport to county jail, Elena reflected on the months of patient documentation that had led to this moment. Every recorded conversation, every documented incident, every carefully preserved email had contributed to a comprehensive legal victory that would protect future victims and establish lasting precedent. Marcus Williams would return to the Fisher Theatre as its honored patron, attending performances in a space redesigned around accessibility and inclusion. Victoria Ashfordshire would serve her sentence in a county jail cell, her fall from pharmaceutical heiress to convicted criminal defendant complete. The cleanup was thorough, the precedent was set, and justice, methodical, documented, and absolute, had been served with interest. Outside the courthouse, Detroit's cultural renaissance continued, but with one fewer voice demanding that disabled people know their place. That voice had found its own place, in a jail cell, learning what happened when casual cruelty met systematic accountability. The Marcus Williams Foundation's mission would continue, funded in part by the woman who tried to destroy it, her prejudice transformed into resources for the people she'd sought to exclude. It was, Elena reflected, a particularly satisfying form of justice, turning discrimination into inclusion, one court victory at a time. 2 years later, Marcus Williams stood at the podium of the Kennedy Center's concert hall in Washington, D.C., addressing the National Conference on Arts Accessibility. The auditorium was packed with theater directors, disability advocates, architects, and federal officials, all gathered to hear about the revolution that had started with one woman's cruelty in a Detroit theater lobby. When my father created the Marcus Williams Foundation, Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect space, he never imagined it would become a national model for civil rights enforcement. But sometimes justice requires more than good intentions, it requires consequences severe enough to change behavior. In the front row, Elena Rodriguez smiled as she watched her former student command the attention of 2,000 arts professionals. The shy teenager who'd been publicly humiliated for existing while disabled had become one of the country's most effective advocates for institutional change. The Victoria Ashfordshire case established precedent that's been cited in 47 subsequent disability harassment prosecutions across 12 states, Marcus continued. More importantly, it demonstrated that documentation, patience, and strategic response could transform individual prejudice into systemic reform. Elena's phone buzzed with a news alert. Victoria's final appeal had been denied by the Michigan Supreme Court. After 2 years of legal maneuvering, her conviction was now permanent, her civil damages final, and her social exile complete. The pharmaceutical heiress who'd once demanded VIP treatment was currently serving the final months of her community service at a Detroit disability advocacy center, where her colleagues included many of the people she'd once dismissed as charity cases. But the real victory, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength, wasn't punishing one person's prejudice. It was proving that institutions can be held accountable for allowing discrimination, that documentation matters, and that disabled people don't have to accept mistreatment in silence. James Williams watched his son from the Kennedy Center's accessibility suite, where he sat with Margaret Sinclair and representatives from the Department of Justice. The Fisher Theatre had become a national model for inclusive arts programming, and James's construction company was now the country's leading contractor for accessibility retrofits. What had begun as a father's love for his son had evolved into a multi-million-dollar industry dedicated to universal design. The Marcus Williams Foundation now operates in 43 cities, Marcus announced to the assembled crowd. We've completed accessibility retrofits in 127 cultural venues, trained over 3,000 arts administrators in inclusive programming, and established legal support networks for discrimination victims in 38 states. Elena thought about the ripple effects that had spread from that marble lobby confrontation. Victoria's documented harassment had sparked federal investigations of accessibility compliance at major venues, resulting in millions of dollars in improvements and policy changes. Her cruel words, preserved in Elena's meticulous files, had become evidence in congressional hearings on strengthening civil rights enforcement. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority Elena remembered from their first training sessions, we've proven that dignity is not negotiable, that inclusion is not charity, and that prejudice, no matter how politely expressed, has consequences. The applause was thunderous, but Marcus wasn't finished. I want to share one final update, he said as the audience quieted. Last week, I received a letter from Victoria Ashford-Chen. She's completing her community service at the Detroit Center for Independent Living, where she's been working with disabled seniors on Medicare advocacy. Her letter was a genuine apology, not the performance she offered in court, but an acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused and the privilege she'd abused. Elena felt a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Victoria's transformation, if genuine, would be remarkable, but Elena had learned to trust evidence over rhetoric. I'm not sharing this to suggest that forgiveness erases accountability, Marcus continued. Ms. Ashford-Chen will live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life. But transformation is possible, even for people whose prejudice seems insurmountable. The same systems that punish discrimination can also educate and rehabilitate. After the presentation, Elena joined Marcus and James for dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol. The conversation inevitably turned to the case that had changed all their lives. Any regrets about how it all went down? James asked his son as they waited for their meals. Marcus considered the question thoughtfully. I regret that it took a public humiliation to create change. But I don't regret the consequences. Victoria's behavior was documented across months. It wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern of systematic prejudice. Without strong consequences, she would have continued harming other disabled people. Elena nodded. The documentation was crucial. If we'd only had her behavior from that one evening, defense attorneys could have dismissed it as a misunderstanding. But the pattern showed intentional, ongoing discrimination. And the social consequences were just as important as the legal ones, Marcus added. Detroit's cultural community needed to see that prejudice against disabled people wouldn't be tolerated. Victoria's exile from those social circles sent a clear message about community values. Their server approached, a young woman whose name tag was printed in both standard text and braille, working in a restaurant that had been retrofitted with Marcus Williams Foundation accessibility improvements. The kind of details that most people never noticed, but that made participation possible for everyone. The real victory, Elena said as they finished their meal, was proving that the system could work. Police took the harassment seriously, prosecutors pursued maximum charges, judges imposed meaningful sentences, and the community rallied around inclusion rather than exclusion. Marcus smiled. And Victoria learned what my father taught me years ago. Actions have consequences, but the consequences depend on your actions. Choose cruelty, face isolation. Choose inclusion, build community. As they walked through D.C.'s evening streets, Elena reflected on the completeness of Victoria Ashford-Chen's fall. The woman who demanded segregation of disabled people was now legally obligated to serve them. The heiress who'd claimed financial superiority was bankrupt, her assets liquidated to fund the very accessibility programs she'd opposed. The social climber who'd attacked others to maintain status had been permanently exiled from the community she'd tried to police. But perhaps most satisfying was the simple fact that Marcus Williams, the teenager she'd dismissed as a charity case, was now one of the most influential disability rights advocates in the country. His voice carried weight in congressional hearings, corporate boardrooms, and cultural institutions across America. The young man Victoria had tried to silence had become impossible to ignore. "You know what I realized?" Marcus said as they approached their hotel. Victoria's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating disabled people, it was underestimating documentation. She thought her prejudice existed in a consequence-free zone, that words disappeared into the air and behavior had no permanent record. Elena smiled grimly. She learned that everything is documented now. Every email, every conversation, every interaction. Prejudice leaves digital footprints, and those footprints become evidence. Exactly, Marcus replied. She thought she was attacking a powerless target. Instead, she attacked someone whose family had spent years building systems to document and respond to exactly her kind of discrimination. She brought a sense of entitlement to a documentation fight, and lost completely. 2 years later, Victoria Ashfordshire name had become a cautionary tale in disability rights training programs across the country. Her documented harassment was studied in law schools as a case study in civil rights enforcement. Her social media rants were preserved in academic research on the psychology of prejudice. Her fall from wealth to bankruptcy was cited in discussions about the real costs of discrimination. But Marcus Williams's name was associated with transformation, inclusion, and the patient work of building a more accessible world. His foundation had changed thousands of lives, improved hundreds of institutions, and established legal precedents that would protect future generations of disabled Americans. The verdict was complete, the cleanup was thorough, and the message was clear: fuck around with civil rights, and you will find out what accountability looks like. Victoria Ashfordshire had fucked around with systematic documentation of her prejudice, and she'd found out that consequences could be comprehensive, permanent, and financially devastating. Justice had been served, one documented incident at a time, until prejudice became evidence and cruelty became criminal conviction. The marble lobby of the Fisher Theatre had become a classroom where Victoria learned that disabled people weren't charity cases or inconveniences, they were citizens with rights, advocates with resources, and families with the power to transform individual discrimination into institutional change. In the end, the woman who demanded that Marcus Williams know his place had learned her own place, in the legal archives as a cautionary tale about what happened when casual cruelty met systematic accountability. Her legacy wasn't the cultural influence she'd craved, but the precedent her prejudice had created for protecting the people she'd tried to harm. The phantom of discrimination had been dragged into the light, and found to be nothing more than a frightened woman in handcuffs, learning too late that dignity wasn't optional and respect wasn't negotiable. The performance was over. Justice had taken its bow. And the standing ovation belonged to everyone who'd refused to let cruelty masquerade as standards, prejudice disguise itself as preferences, or discrimination hide behind politeness. Marcus Williams walked into the D.C. evening as a testament to what happened when love, documentation, and patient advocacy combined to create lasting change. Victoria Ashfordshire served her sentence as a reminder that some lessons could only be learned the hard way, through consequences severe enough to penetrate the armor of entitlement and force recognition of other people's humanity. The verdict was final: respect costs nothing, but disrespect costs everything.